Not enough for opening opposition to the particular notions which they espouse. And I think although they can speak as fast as they want and use as many subpoints as they want, I think they expose themselves as complete fucking bozos when they use an example of Obama as someone who achieved substantial change, because he was the one who necessarily hamstrung himself by always trying to get 2/3 supermajorities in Congress and the Senate. He was the one who never went tooth and claw to fight against the Republicans, who were the ones who were like locking voters up in gerrymandered districts, because he was the one who believed in good faith, and he was not the one who recognized the evil that stared across him from the other side of the aisle. Incredibly proud to propose 3 areas in this speech. First of all, that democracy in and of itself is flawed. Second of all, how we protect against populism far better than opening opposition and probably closing opposition, judging by their point of information. And then last of all, how we better achieve reform to the system. On the first, democracy is flawed. One, in its current guise, because it is captured by entrenched powers, because it necessarily works to exclude the very lowest of the low. This looks like voter ID laws that disproportionately target African Americans and lock them out of voting. This looks like huge amounts of money being pumped into campaigns for the far right wing. And note that this basically destroys opening opposition, because at this stage their only benefit is anesthetic. They say, well, you can't believe they're evil, but if you don't believe they're evil, how can you confront them? How can you confront the fact that they are working with every bit of effort they have to undermine you? That is why you necessarily need to oppose its democracy in its current guise. But second of all, even in its very ideal case, we say that it is ruled by the majority, by the 51%, and so necessarily it will always be working against the interest of minorities. And so what you need to do is you need to have the rhetoric that says democracy is flawed, that says watch out because democracy is probably going to backslide if you don't treat it well. And what that means is you need to implement all of these protections for minority groups. You need incredibly detailed constitutions that need to protect people against the power of the majority. Because if you believe too much in democracy, you are not going to build in protections against the very worst anti-democratic actions. But also, we just pointed the fact that people just are often very not informed, they are often incredibly selfish, and also there are some things that necessarily should not be dictated by the populace. That looks like central bank policy, that looks like Supreme Court appointments. So when you have complete faith in democracy, you are far less likely to criticize partisan appointments to Supreme Courts, partisan appointments to central banks, and the like. So what this means is the burden of the opposition is to prove that the activists should declaw themselves. They need to prove that what we should believe is a lie, that we should take the anesthetic, that we should believe things are all right, because that's the only way we're ever going to reach across the aisle. The aisle is never going to be reached across. The people on the other side are never going to treat you in good faith. We sure as hell are going to treat them in bad faith. So how do we protect against populism? Opening opposition gives a number of mechanisms. Most are basically the same. The first is that, well, there's like this game theoretic thing, which isn't sort of comparative at all, but the thing that makes it comparative is it says you give them the rhetoric to act on this, because you sort of need to act first. You need to sort of, and you have the rhetoric on which to act to sort of take up arms. But this sort of applies like either way, as in the democracy is sort of undermined under either side of the house. I'll get on this with it's basically just sort of substantive point that replies that I'm getting to in about 30 seconds. And then they say it encourages demonization. This wasn't proven to be a harm. Yes, you might be able to work with the Republicans, they weren't going to work with you anyway. Or in the case they were, you're going to have to water it down to make so many concessions. Look at Obama's presidency. What the fuck has he accomplished except like ordering a drone strike on a 14-year-old? So, how do we protect against populism? 3 ways. First of all, you stop it from arising in the first place because it fixes issues that people get mad about. But also we say that populism arises most of all from a failed hope, from people seeing the encroach of democracy. And we would note that the people who are most anti-democracy in the first place, people that say that democracy is failing, are centrists. That is, there are studies and the centrists are the ones who hate it the most because they are the ones who came from hoping in it and having their faith undermined. So what we do is we stop the failed hope that makes people turn to misery, that makes people even worse than otherwise. But second of all, people are going to be angry either way, and what we do is we let all parties cater to that simmering rage. And so what happens if they do not critique, or if they acknowledge the flaws in the system, or they don't acknowledge the flaws in the system, this was Shan Chan's material that got no response, but they compete on what their actual solutions are to fix it, and in that case things get way better on our side. But third of all, it encourages the building of systems that protect against encroachments on democracy, because you need to acknowledge that democracy is flawed, that it is vulnerable, and that it is far, far, far more likely to backslide than otherwise. In order to build these protections into it, you need to acknowledge that the populace is flawed. So what that means is you're far more likely, one, to implement checks and balances against democratic overreach, but second of all, to limit the power of elected officials in enshrining way more bigger protections for example central banks or for independent courts. This is where I'll deal with the point about nascent democracies from opening opposition. They say, well, you need faith for it to take off. We say you need a healthy skepticism in order to build in regulations against it collapsing. But also what happens is you need to address the flaws in it. Because often these, emerging democracies, for instance, the example I think of Kenya was given by them, are ones that are incredibly ethnically based, are ones that have incredibly huge amounts of inequality, and often the people running for parliament are the ones who are empowered by previous colonial rulers, like for instance the Kenyatta family in Kenya. But third of all, what happens is at best you simply delay the backslide, because you do not address the problems that people have with the actual system. You simply say, you just paint lipstick on the mirror, put on a happy face. Who's got a POI? Cowards. All right, I'll move on. Nice engagement. No, you missed your chance. So, wait, okay, opening. Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so basically, it's not like these people independently limit themselves. It's that there is a collective political will to do this. Because under your side, you give the game theory take, but in this case, it's in everyone's collective interest to work together, right? But also we'd point to the fact that on the status quo, one side is putting up the guardrails and the other side is simply not putting them up. And so in that case, I think you need to actually be able to oppose it. But also we would, so moving on to the last bit, reform to the system. Two general areas here. The first is that you actually reform the system of democracy in the first place, because you necessarily need to recognize the problems in the first place. But also we would say recognizing a system as corrupt is far more motivating than simply saying, oh, well, this system is good, but it's suboptimal and could maybe be sort of tinkered with a bit. They say people will just think, why bother, and they'll simply give up. But we say, we don't have to support hatred of democracy, we have to support skepticism and pessimism, which is far more likely to motivate people to fix it. And on opposition, they basically declaw any attempts at reform, which was stuff like Obama trying to respect supermajority, norms about supermajorities, and trying to contend bipartisanship and stuff like that. But also would say that optimism necessarily gags reform, because you can never acknowledge that the other side are directly working against you and are acting in bad faith, and because you always wait till the next cycle, every time you lose an election, you simply sit back and just wait and you just hope things that get better. Last of all, on non-democratic means under this point, we say you simply don't divert energy from other means of activism. We would point to the huge amount, decline in the amount of strikes and direct action taken by workers in the first world as an example of this. These are actually good for us, and this basically comes over their sort of game theoretic analysis on-site opening opposition. The extent to which they say violence happens, they don't address what people actually want to be violent about, and so that point is just incredibly marginal. At the end of this, we are the side that says things are bad because things are bad. They have to lie to people, they have to support people declawing themselves in reform, and that is why opening government cuts through to the next round.
Government said the word structural approximately 1,500 times, but never pointed out that the structural issues they claim that democracy has, that it tends towards majoritarianism in some cases, that elites have disproportionate power, are reasons why democracy is far better than all the alternatives, which have all those shitty things, like elites having all the power and minorities getting screwed over, without having any of the checks that are inherent to what a liberal democracy means. This is clear in Will's speech, and I think is never properly engaged with, but is rather strawmanned by the deputy leader of opposition. It isn't the case that they're protecting regulations on government and we have unmitigated campaign finance. Rather, it is the case that the sort of institutions that check against majoritarianism, like independent judiciaries, like term limits, are the cornerstones of any democratic system, and belief in those institutions is exactly what we are defending, and I think that's why we take this debate. I think Will has proven to you why the worst case for their side, that they just tend to total authoritarianism and people take up arms against the government because they don't believe the government can get any better, is clearly worse, but also I think that we get more reform and better democracy on our side of the house. What do they tell you? They say, democracy is flawed. I think I already dealt with that. They say, if you don't believe that the opposition is evil, how do you ever oppose them? So first of all, I don't think they ever give you reason to believe that this opposition would be in good faith. Like, they want you to believe that, when you believe democracy is flawed, now you enact all sorts of regulations. But I think we'll give you reasons to believe why you don't think those regulations or those guardrails would work, because you have absolutely no faith in the opposition to abide by the rules you've set up. So instead, you take up arms and just overthrow democracy altogether and try to make sure the opposition never gets into power, so they never have to fail to abide by the rules that you yourself are abiding by. They say, Obama was a little bitch who didn't do anything. Look, first of all, a lot of good things happened under Obama. We got universal health care for the first time in America. We got gay marriage being legalized. A lot of positive things happened. But I think even if it restricted Obama's power a little bit, that he respected the supermajority, him doing that is what allows us to restrain Trump in the status quo. It makes it much harder for Trump to have the unmitigated cock of democracy, which is what he wanted in the first place, because there is historical precedent of people respecting democratic institutions and believing that they can get better. When we advocate for an optimistic view of democratic politics, optimism is inherently forward-looking. That doesn't mean we can't criticize democracy as it currently exists, but that we have an optimistic view of the future of democracy. We are optimistic about what democracy could be in its best form, and we actually agitate to try to get there. The next thing they say is that they stop populism because centrists hate democracy. I think they just made that up. I don't think that's true. They think, now politicians are competing on solutions to fix problems. Here's why this isn't the case. I think they say, politicians are lying to you and making fake promises on your side of the house, but they never engage with what the alternative is. I don't think it's the case that they innovate on solutions, unclear what that looks like. Rather, they don't bother making any promises to you whatsoever. They don't even try to pretend like they are respecting your preferences. They don't even try to pretend like they are abiding by the rules of democratic institutions, because no one expects them to. If you never believe that the leader you elected would do what they said they were going to do, you never hold them accountable. It is exactly scorned promises that push people out into the political sphere, make them non-violently protest, make them vote in the next election, and make sure the next thing is different. I think one argument they had in the Prime Minister's speech is like, now you're just kicking issues down the line because you always believe that the next person that you elect is going to fix it. So first, I think this is kind of a good thing that you're not discarding the system of democracy whatsoever, but waiting until the next electoral cycle instead of just killing your ethnic neighbor. But I also think the alternative on their side is either you take up arms against the government, or you totally disengage from democracy because you believe democracy is never able to fight climate change. So what's the point of even trying? What's the point of joining the Sierra Club? Let's just let the fossil fuel industry take over democracy and destroy us all. They say, they limit politicians' power better on their side of the house. I think it is telling that their response to Will's POI was bad. That is, you only install guardrails, you only have when you believe that the game theory is actually going to work in their favor, when there is an equilibrium that can be reached. If you demonize and villainize your opponents, there is actually an impact to this argument. That is, villainizing your opponents means that you believe that when they get into power, they are going to destroy you. They are not going to abide by the checks and regulations. If you're a minority group or in a like an ethnically divided state, if you believe that the other ethnic group will get into power and immediately lock all your people up, it is A, really important to you that they never get into power, which launches you into all-out war, but B, make sure that you don't install any guardrails on your own power because you don't believe the other people would follow those guardrails when they get into power. But I also want to point out that the mechanism for even their best case scenario is, you don't need politicians to enact these guardrails, which doesn't make any sense, you do. But they say you have a collective political will to have these guardrails that's stronger on their side of the house. But then I don't think they deal with the vast majority of the best argumentation that came out in Will's speech, that people are actually only engaged with the democratic system when they can get better. I think the type of engagement they have is either so pessimistic that it overthrows the system and leads to no democracy whatsoever, which, as Will already explained to you, is the best form of government because at least leaders are at least trying to respect people's preferences, or it is such that they totally disengage. Closing. Look, it is possible that there are some flawed democracies out there, but A, I think we've proven to you that democracies at least get better because people believe they can get better, and to the extent that this is a debate round, on balance, democracies are preferable, but I also think let's give them their best case. Let's say on their side of the house, we have a few more corrupt democracies. But I think what Will's proven to you is that you at least get more democracies on our side of the house, even if they are a little bit more corrupt. That is, in especially nascent or post-conflict states, the only way democratic norms take root whatsoever is when you can establish a little bit of trust in the long run. And I think we tell you that having more democracy is at least preferable to having, like, having more democracies outweighs their impact of corrupt democracies, because at least you have some solvents, at least there are some democratic ideals written into your constitution that judges and politicians have to at least try to live up to, so they can't violate your rights in the most brazen way. Also, corrupt leaders jag sometimes, like Indira Gandhi called a snap election because she thought she was going to win, but ushered in a new end to the emergency period and a new wave of democracy because she had to abide by the democratic norms that were written into the constitution, and people believed that elections could work. I think we've proven to you that we get more democracy on our side of the house, but that is the most important thing, particularly if you're weighing on places where people's preferences are not respected by their governments at all. At least aspiring towards democracy is preferable, but also even on their ground we win. We tell you why you get better democratic norms, why people at least try to engage in the system of government, and why we get the best lives for people overall.
Some democratic leaders do good and help people. Some democratic leaders do bad. They cause undue violence. They say women don't deserve to drive. Something that is true regardless is that if you only view democracy as unquestionably good, you allow imperialism and you allow the excuse of saying countries can go in and invade other countries because we have the best democratic system. We're the best political system, sorry. That's our extension. We're going to say that your model, that only when you have a critical perception of democracy can you ever deconstruct the ideas of imperialism and stop them using it as an excuse to enter Afghanistan because it's unquestionably the best way. So, well, the world views democracy cynically. It means they do not automatically assume that it's the best institution. This means you can scrutinize it, but also that you can be open to other suggestions, like a good technocratic regime can be as good as a democracy. Autocratic regimes that are good to their people can be as good as democracies. The problem with the status quo is when you have this idealistic view of democracy, you justify invasions. You justify viewing certain nations as less good because they have a less developed political system, which leads to other flow-on effects. We don't think we stand for a world in which you can justify going in for oil based on human rights things that don't exist because you say that democracy is the best way to go. So, why do we deconstruct imperialism? First of all, we can see that democracy is not perfect, it is not the best system. Instead, we view it pessimistically and realistically and say that it can be flawed and is not inherently better than any other political system. Secondly, politicians can no longer use it as the trump card of saying it is the best thing ever, let's give it to others, because politicians themselves do not see it as the best system and people do not perceive it as the best. Thirdly, other countries' perceptions of democracy are also challenging it. You no longer say, oh, it's okay, America, you're going in, but that's because you're doing the best for civilians. You say, democracy is not an inherent good thing. Why are you actually going in? You cannot have this mandate. You cannot go into this country. Right now, democracy is beyond scrutiny. That's why it's an automatic win in debating to say you've eroded the democratic rights of people. But democracy is not an inherent good thing. It is only good insofar as it does good for the people, which we think does not always happen. We do not think there is a good excuse to go into other countries. But also, we think it leads to flawed priorities. When you think that democracy is the best thing and the most important thing, when you have a country that's gone to civil war, instead of developing systems and institutions that are robust, you try and install democracy. That's why when the Syrian crisis happened, instead of prioritizing on the stability of that region, they just tried to install democracy, which failed, led to more instability, led to a gap which let ISIS form because they thought democracy was the priority, democracy is the best thing ever. While in that system, it might have been a lot better just to have a stable government that did not allow this whole to form. We think that would be far better. It should not be the priority above everything else. The other thing we can say is you no longer look down at other countries who aren't democracies and say they are lesser and less civilized. Right now, we view democracy as the end evolution of a government, that you have to reach it and you can go through other different stages, but that is the end goal. That means that any country that does not have a democracy is viewed as inferior to other countries, and that's incredibly harmful when we already have racial preconceptions about different countries and different ways in which we view it as the best. The important thing is, you do not get situations where you can justify an entire invasion because your system is better than another. You cannot say that one system of government is the best. You have to prove that your system is good and is subject to challenges. This means you cannot get American imperialism or other countries colonizing because there is no system of government that is perfect and is better. That is a harm that exists regardless of whether democracies are good or bad, and that is something we bring you exclusively as SDG. Yes, closing. I just don't think that's true when there is a worldwide and holistic conception that a certain democracy, that a certain system is better. I think other things are subject to more scrutiny than the idealistic system everyone should strive towards that is the end evolution of people. This has hundreds of years of backing that has been building around this narrative. Any other excuse can be deconstructed in a way that democratic principles, which are looked at as the epiphany of human evolution, is something that is untouchable in a way that other things are not. Engaging in the opening half of this debate about democracies, we think the important thing to recognise in this debate is it's not just majoritarianism or populism, as our OG wanted to say, it is the fact that democracies can no longer function or exist in the world we currently live in. This is for a couple of reasons. The first and most important thing is that the rise of technology and algorithms means that democracy actually just cannot be actualised. Because look at the Cambridge Analytica scandal that happened. Facebook controlled who voted in which way because they were able to control what kind of news articles you were seeing. They're able to aggressively do propaganda to make sure they're targeting specific people, which means that you never actually have a democracy on either side of the house. You just have corporations who are able to push their agendas, which means that democracy is never actualized. So we think it's not a question of imperfect democracies, but rather it is always going to be certain corporations and systems that are running those democracies, which is what the context we occur in. But secondly, it's incredibly easy to corrupt democracies under the status quo. If Rupert Murdoch decides to only slam a certain politician, they never get elected. That's why when you call a certain politician a communist, they never ever get to power in the first place. But also, the fear-mongering of Trump saying that everyone's coming to get you and we should build a wall means that instead of voting based on rationale, people are just voting based on fear. The important thing is that all of the harms of the opening side exist no matter what. Majoritarianism, the power of the elite, they exist both in autocratic regimes and democracies. The thing that exists only in democracies is the fact that you think you have a say, but you do not when corporations are controlling that, and that is insidious. But also, we think it's worse if you say that democratic mandate is the only thing that matters, because Bolivia had a democratic mandate to open fire on protesters because they were elected democratically. We think as many human rights atrocities can happen on both sides. We think that that is not something that exists. But also, we think, especially with minority groups, because they never have a voice, you are justified in doing those kind of human rights abuses to them. Why do we think it gets better on outside the house? When you have a pessimistic view of democracy, you set up institutions assuming that democracy will be bad and will be fail. That's why you constitutionally entrench human rights, because you say, what if we get a Trump? What if democracy isn't perfect? We should protect ourselves in case these things happen. That's why you don't have a health system that depends on the benevolence of Obama giving you free healthcare. You create a healthcare system that is going to be affordable to everyone because you assume the worst possible person will get in. That means you make structures that are going to withstand the test of time and withstand the worst democracy because you assume it's going to be bad instead of assuming a good leader will get in. This also deals with all of the things that OO want to say, the POI we think that their extension is going to be about why it leads to worse systems, because you actually build your system assuming it will fail, and so you build it to the best of its ability. You make courts not be elected because you assume that politicians can be bad and elect bad judges, so you make sure it is rigorous and withstands that. And also, the final thing we note here is that democratic principles should not be student to other things. So we should not say that judges should be democratically elected, or even the school captains should be democratically elected, because democracy is not always the best thing in the world. We'd rather have the most meritocratic way, and that doesn't happen when it is the elites that rule this. At the end of the speaker, we think that there are a bunch of harms with majoritarianism, there are a bunch of harms with the elites, but they happen in every single regime. Every single regime has elites that can triumph. What we don't want is the West saying we have the most evolved version of democracy, we have the version of democracy you should stand for, we will invade, and the rest of the world going, okay, America, you do it, help those poor people.
first thing I want to do in this speech is discuss what we think being pessimistic and cynical about democracy actually looks like. Because we think if you believe the rhetoric of the opposition, you're going to think that pessimism equals throwing your hands up about the concept of democracy and either racing to entrench your power, as is the case of the opening, or either oppressing all minorities, as is the case of the closing. We think being pessimistic about something is far more plausibly not the abandonment of that concept altogether, but the recognition that that concept is not infallible or flawless or perfect, and not being unduly optimistic or idealistic about this. Before I explain why our conception of what being interacting with this system looks like is more plausible though, I just want to step through exactly all the ways that side opposition explain pessimism and why you just should not believe them in this debate. So, to begin with, we hear from opening opposition that when you are pessimistic about democracy, the first thing you're going to do is race to entrench all of your powers in a very autocratic way so that your enemy can never entrench that. A couple of responses here. The first thing, and the most important thing I think to note in this debate, is that this is obviously not a debate about how democratic leaders react and view their system, but the millions of people who exist in that system and how they themselves view their leaders. That is to say that perhaps, in their most generous case, the leaders of that system, when they are overly pessimistic about democracy, may attempt to entrench that power. But we thought all of the millions of people who existed below that would be pessimistic about the incentives of that leadership and why they were entrenching that power and why they were being autocratic in the first place. We did not think it was plausible to think that those people would accept very happily the kind of autocracy that that side of the House wanted to say. But note that they get even less realistic at opening opposition, right? Because they tell you that, well, you're going to just give up because of the collective action problem on concepts like protest and just let the fossil fuel industry overrun all of your society. We just think, ladies and gentlemen, in this debate, that the average society still cares about concepts like their well-being and their quality of life and are going to want to not to allow these kinds of concepts to occur. We just did not think that opening opposition presented a plausible case of what pessimism and cynicism looked like in our society when it was targeted at those public institutions. But, no, I'll take closing actually. Okay, I will go to all of my imperialism stuff right now. So, your only response to this aspect of our extension, right, is just to say, oh, well, lots of things are imperialist and we can use lots of different convenient narratives to be imperialist and continue to do so in your world. I've got 4 responses. The first is just to say that to the extent that narratives around democracy are your only reason to be imperialist, we still minimize the quantity of imperialism you can justify on outside the House. So at our worst case, that is a comparative benefit. The second thing to say, though, is that we would actually support a world in which the narrative around imperialism was not, oh, these people's system of government are inherently inferior, but rather things like they have been murdering thousands of Kurds. We think that was still a better perception of how those international relations ought to occur, and we were so proud to support that on our side of the House. But the third thing to say is that these types of imperialist conduct just have less support by the people of those governments who are committing that imperialism when they do not view democracy overly optimistic and idealistically. That meant that the extent to which that imperialism could occur and be supported by those people was just dramatically reduced when those people were pessimistic and cynical about why you were attempting to install those democracies in the first place. We were the team that uniquely recognized that having the mandate of the people was not the most ideal metric to select that leadership, and we did not think that in our world the American government could justify supporting coups in Latin America when we did not view the systems of government in these countries as inherently inferior. That's why our imperialist extension was extremely important in this debate. But note that that was not the only aspect of the extension that gave you. It's just the only one that CG decided to respond to. But we actually told you a lot more information about democracy extending on our opening, not just to say that democracy is flawed, but is on an actively negative trajectory when it is being hijacked by corporations, hijacked by algorithms, and in fact cynicism has never been more important when interacting with our public institutions than it is in the status quo. That's why we're proud to support it. Because note that we thought that like democracies as they exist in the status quo are susceptible to things like democratic paradoxes. That is to say that you can democratically elect governments who have the mandate to violate your rights. Dom wanted to give us a history lesson on Bolivia. That's all well and good, but there are thousands of alternative examples. Nazi Germany was democratically elected, for example. I know that one is true. So we thought that to the extent that that could still occur and those rights could still be violated, that was really harmful and regrettable, and we definitely oppose that on our side of the house. But note that that is more difficult to oppose in their side of the world, right? Because obviously these things exist on a spectrum. To the extent that we acknowledge, for example, that Trump is a genuinely terrible politician whose power should not be able to be entrenched, that is able to be excused by numbers of people, organizations, by saying, oh, well, he had the mandate and the will of the people, so I guess that that is okay. Note that when we do not view that as a legitimate metric for establishing leadership, because it is not inherently the most ideal or best way to select that leadership, we are able to be more critical to those kinds of things short opening. Like, I don't know if this debate is really going to hang its hat on supermajority rules. I don't think that is necessarily the most inherent aspect of a democracy and whether or not we should be pessimistic about it. This debate wasn't about certain aspects or guardrails of that democracy like supermajority rules. It was about, I think, much more fundamentally, as our closing block tells us, the building blocks of that democracy. That is, the concept of voting people in that extended to other institutions when we did not think it was right to do so. Because it was not plausible, we think, for our closing to come out here and put this massive overemphasis on how minorities were likely to be locked out of that system and become more disengaged. We thought those minorities were never going to have a democratic mandate in the first place in a lot of instances. So that was just a really nebulous harm that could even play into this debate in the first place, but also was something that could be better addressed when we had systems that recognized that that will of the people was not the most important aspect of how we selected that leadership. At the end of this speech, then, we recognize that democracies can do very problematic things, and their capacity to do so is only being further entrenched. We need a healthy pessimism, we need a healthy skepticism, and opposition has never proved that that means throwing our hands up. Obviously, that's why we win on CG.
Are we good to go? Can I be heard? Opening government's claim is this: the status quo is unfair, disproportionately affects minorities, and as a result must change. And they point correctly to the structural problems of majoritarianism and populism in order to demonstrate that. The question of this debate, however, is the way in which that change is likely to occur. Dom explains that narratives that are based around the idea of populism and majoritarianism mean that in circumstances in which you degrade people's faith in democracy and their belief in that democracy, the subsequent reforms that you get are not the nature of the reforms that the opening government is describing in terms of the highly technocratic reforms that would allow for better representation or minority protections, but rather the same thing that we have already seen in some democracies, which is an establishment of harsher forms of majoritarianisms that better allow for enabling of populism. And we give you three precise reasons, and this is obviously quite discrete from our opening. We merely talk about the degradation of the democratic function. We explain how into a stable holding pattern, democracies can fall in ways that become much less representative of the needs of minorities. We give you three, to borrow the expression of our opening that I've come to quite enjoy over this tournament, warrants for this. Firstly, on disengagement, we say that disengagement is disproportionately harmed against minorities who both tend to have worse engagement with information and tend to have greater lived experience that are caused with the effects of negativity. Secondly, we establish that the majority in this debate is racist and sexist, which means insofar as you are instituting reforms on the basis that the previous system has failed, it is easy to persuade them that they will not subsequently succeed. And thirdly, we tell you that the structures that are already creating problems, particularly the ones that closing government speaks to, continue to last. People continue to be wealthy. There continues to be control of the information flow that tells people about the nature of the structural problems that they face, and so forth. Tony's only response to this is that minorities are already treated badly under the status quo, and that is, of course, to a degree true. The first response that Dom provides you is that that is, of course, capable of getting worse in almost every jurisdiction in the world, and if you believe the logic that analysis is subsequently able to predict events, which is literally the premise of debating, assuming there is some room for it to get worse, it presumably will. The second response, though, is that democracies are not majoritarian exclusively in the sense that ethnic minorities are still owners of political capital, still are able to have possession of allies, still, because they are disproportionately passionate, are disproportionately capable of participating in activism. So minorities under the status quo, under hopeful conceptions, are able to succeed. But finally, Dom explains that it is only on a comparative of optimism that people have the sense of unity and sort of optimism about the nature of the country, that they are not going to engage in divide and conquer politics, but instead going to engage with the real issues of the community. And additionally, he provides you a subsequent substantive reason, which is the idea that this leads to substantial benefits in terms of additional information in the news media, because everybody's not blathering on about the fundamental building blocks being fucked up. They are instead talking about the ways in which things are able to get better. Which means we are the team that answers the challenge that opening government addresses in this debate. Yes, democracies will change as a result of your policies. The underlying structures of them will change. They will change for the worse, because the factors that undergird that change are disproportionately weighed against minorities. This is superior to our opening for 4 reasons. Firstly, because it is cyclical in nature, as Dom tells you. Once that structure is entrenched, it only gets worse. Secondly, because it affects the most downtrodden in the community, instead of being generic analysis about the ability of Harry Reid to do whatever he wants. Thirdly, because we take the most sympathetic version of the burden that our opening government has established in this debate, and as a result do a superior job rebutting them by acknowledging that many of their premises are incorrect. And fourthly, because as Tony has acknowledged, political leaders in these environments are often cynical and not subject to norms. Juxtapose that to the alternative. Now to explain why that is more likely than the set of mechanisms that Shan provides about the positive future, which, as Mark correctly notes in a point of information, has existed in this debate. Dom, however, gives it a set of useful responses, because the analysis is, firstly, there are problems of social and political capital that are disproportionately allocated. As Dom explains, that doesn't change. Secondly, the opposition says that people now better understand the issues that are presented to them. And Dom gives you 2 reasons that's not true on the comparative. Firstly, because unsophisticated consumers meeting highly technocratic issues like judge allocations or mixed member proportional voting systems as opposed to first past the post voting systems are far more likely to turn to easy narratives based in race and class. So they don't better understand the issues. And the third thing that they say is that you have the motivation to act, to upturn your democracy. And of course this is true. That is exactly what we fear, that the motivation that opening government describes is weaponized in the way that they predict, down the lines of sectarian and ethnic conflict. I will now take a point of information from opening. As I identified, the nature of that change is bad. Yes, it is true. Anger is a powerful motivator. It leads to many of the worst crimes in the history of the world. But we demonstrate that that force is not one that is best left tapped, and rather we would be better leaving it alone. Additionally, I deny the premise that hope is not an important motivator, because hope obviously inspires in people ideas of passion, and hope implies in people other ideas like collective unity. Feelings of hope make it easier for you to see other people as people that are deserving of respect and deserving of value. Now finally, to talk about closing government, a team that began by demonstrating that they wanted to end imperialism, and then began their whip speech by demonstrating that their burden was extraordinarily low because they didn't need to defend any more than an absolutely milquetoast characterization. Let's be clear about what they're talking about. All that they're saying is that in this debate, when rational leaders want to go to war, they use this as an excuse. We tell you that there are other narratives. They tell you that this narrative is a powerful one. We tell you the narrative of ethnic cleansing or genocide is at least as powerful. They tell you this might lead to less support. The question is, how often does that less support lead to less intervention? The answer to that question is almost never. Iraq is a catastrophic example. World War II is a catastrophic example. It clearly would have failed. And then, of course, there is a harm, because if the Americans had gone into Iraq but with less willingness, they would have just pulled out earlier and hastened the subsequent collapse, right? Like, the invasion of Iraq was bad, but the Americans' half-hearted engagement with it was catastrophic. So it's not actually clear that less support is a good thing. The next thing to say is that it's in tension with what their opening said, which John said to no response. The next thing to say is that these systems make you feel much more selfish, which means that you're more likely to invade on the basis of selfish needs, like oil, which again John tells you to no response. Again, John tells you that it might not always be bad. For example, interventions in genocidal context in which you need every bit of policy support. Again, John tells you that to no response. And finally, John tells you that now if you invade, your incentive is to put in dictatorships, because the question of what you do post-Reconstruction is much more informed about the norm of what a good government system is. Closing government has responded to almost nothing we said, which is pretty good for us, because we perfectly explain how everything that opening government said means the world turns to hell. We're very, very proud to oppose.